afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone has had their tea and is not as sleepy as as we usually are in afternoon sessions. So this is a hybrid session. So we are also still learning and adapting. So bear with us if there are any technical glitches as we navigate this space. So this panel discussion is on challenges and opportunities of using technology and digital data in monitoring, evaluation, and learning with a focus on South Asia. We have some panelists joining us online and some in person. So I'd like to invite the panelists to please take the stage. And those of you who are joining online, please to keep your video on so that we are able to interact in real time. The chair for the session is Linda, who is joining online. Hi, Linda. Can you
Hi,
hear
everybody.
us? Are we audible? Okay, great. I also invite the panelists of the session, Krishanu Chakrabarti and Akashi Kaul, who are here with us in person to please take the stage. And we have Sohini Mukherjee and Shruti Vishwanathan who are joining us online. Hi, Sohini, can you hear us?
Yes, can hear you. Yes.
Great. And hi, Shruti. We are connected and you can hear us? Okay, great. So I believe everyone is connected and present here. Linda, over to you to start us off on session with an introduction.
Thank you. I hope everybody can hear me okay. Welcome and thanks for joining the session today. I'm Linda Raftree and I'll be facilitating the discussion. We've been collaborating with Sambodhi on this topic of technology-enabled monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning for the conference and then hopefully beyond the conference as well. MERL is an organization that looks at three basic areas. One is how can we use new tools and technologies for data collection and for MERL, which monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning are the areas that we look at. So MERL Tech. We also look at improving capacities of evaluators to evaluate programs that have technology components within them. And a third area that we look at is the use of data from different types of technology applications and how that data can also be better used for monitoring, evaluation, and drawing out insights. So the panel today is an exciting one because we've got experts who will talk about those different areas. Some of the things we've seen over the last 3 years in the MERL tech space is that we've been quite affected by COVID-19, and we've seen a lot of monitoring and evaluation efforts having to go virtual or remote. We've seen service provision and government services and NGO services having to be remote as well, and doing quite a lot of remote data collection, as well as an increased attention to administrative data, alternative data sources, big data. And so the field is really starting to change and shift, and we're seeing a lot more technologies and a lot more digital data being incorporated into our work. At the same time, we're seeing new data privacy regulations coming out and in many countries around the world, including in India and in several countries in Asia. And a growing awareness that while digital data is quite positive for our work, it also has some potential negative impacts and effects. For example, we can introduce biases, new kinds of biases. We can see data being used to manipulate people, people's ideas, people's opinions on social media, for example. We see different types of harms that can come out of data as well. For example, if there are data breaches and sensitive data is released out to the public, or data is hacked into, or simply carelessly, left around on laptops and that sort of thing. Some of the risks and harms that can happen when we are not careful with data, especially digital data, can really grow because of the nature of digital data. It's very easy to replicate. It's very easy to spread in very wide ways, which makes it slightly different than paper data. We've also seen concerns about surveillance, and can the growing amounts of data be used to surveil specific communities and potentially, again, to do harm. And so really, when we think about the incorporation of new technologies, new tools, digital data into our monitoring and evaluation work, we want to be quite aware of all of these challenges and harms so that we can make the best use of new types of data collection and new types of analysis and different things we can do with data, and making sure that we're not causing harm or contributing to any negative impacts or unintended consequences. There have been quite a lot of growing movements related to localization, to decolonization, to data protection that are coming up alongside movements to incorporate greater tools and technologies into MERL. There have also been greater interests in youth and community-led processes with relation to development data and MERL. So all these shifts really point to the need to address ethics and to address these new approaches in our evaluation work. So those are some of the themes that we'll hear from panelists about today. I'd like to introduce, if you just want to wave, and I hope I'm pronouncing everyone's name correctly, Krishanu Chakraborty from ID Insight is on today's panel. Sohini Mukherjee from CLEAR, also from JPEL, I believe. Shruti Viswanathan from Athena Infonomics, excuse me, and Akashi Ko from Sambodhi. So Krishanu is going to tell us a little bit about the wider landscape in the India context. Sohini is going to talk about some wider issues of ethics with data and technology. Shruti is going to cover 3 kinds of biases that we can find in the use of big data. And Akashi is going to look at the evolving role of ethics in digitized MERL spaces. We'll have some discussion on these different points, and we really encourage you to ask any questions and share your thoughts as well. We have people online and we have people present in the room. So if you're online, you can ask any of your questions through the chat, and then I'll be fielding those questions and introducing those questions into the discussion. And if you're there physically present in the room, I'm not sure exactly what the routine is for you to ask questions or to contribute from the room, but please make sure that that you're using a microphone or somehow making sure that those of us who are online are able to hear any questions and comments from the room. So I will end my introduction there, and I'd like to hand off to Krishanu, who's going to talk about kind of the broader aspects and the broader framing for this panel. So over to you.
Okay. Thanks, Linda, and thanks everyone who has joined here, online, offline. Everyone, it's great to be here, obviously. So those of who just just have joined, I think one of the things when we are starting the panel, so obviously being the first speaker is a little, I don't know, intimidating, especially when I know that there are so many like esteemed speakers just after me. So I'll try to keep this to my knowledge base and my at least like the little that I know. So when we thought about this panel and I read the broader agenda, I thought that let's first start with like what I would mean by digital data in this context, because that given that term is like used so widely, it may sometimes mean a lot of different things to different people itself. So one way of thinking of digital data is definitely the set of interactions and the set of data points essentially that are generated through any digital interaction, which may be in the internet or otherwise. I will actually steer a little clear of that part, because getting into digital interaction-based data from the social networks as we know it, or any other human interaction that happens over the internet, has its own, and it requires like multiple panels to get into how we can understand about the broader community and demographics and things that we are interested in from that data itself. But mostly when we, at least like when I speak about digital data, I want to contain the discussion, or at least my thoughts, into 3 parts of it, which is that what happens when you use a set of digital tools, techniques, or associated any advancement for that matter that allows us to do two things. One is that we fundamentally change the way we have acquired data, and maybe even a primary or anything that is related to near primary data for that matter. And second is what other data sources, which when we look at something that is non-tabular for that matter, so who are interested in this like general amount of tabular data that comes in from the field, or we think of this as a series of rows and like variables. But there is also something beyond that, which is sometimes non-tabular in nature. And one of the easiest examples is obviously data from social networks or even geospatial data for that matter, which can be tabulated, but it's not tabular in its core format. Now, when we think of the, and this is what I feel, and very happy to like in comments. So when we think of the advancement of technology and related advancements for that matter in this two context, the one of the ways that we can think of is how it has changed three broad areas that encompasses everything related to data that we need for monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So the first part is access, right? Like the accessibility of data and the generation and the ease and cost and time, everything related to access. The second part, which I think we overlook sometimes a bit, is the quality, right? So the data that is coming in, can I argue that because of these digital tools, the data that is coming in or the data that we are using for our monitoring, evaluation, or learning purposes, is it summarily better? And there are some examples that I will share some concerns. And then the third part, which is related to both access and quality, is these, I would say, inherent biases that we don't think of, and some trade-offs that we do unconsciously. But I mean, there are now recent researches to just some light on that matter. So on these three topics, the way that I want to structure this is I'll provide some examples from the work that I do. And if I know of like some evidence base that's already there, I will refer to that, and then just end. So that's all. That's the opening remark. So let's start with access. So I think it's the easiest way again, like to think of this is this switch from a very paper-oriented or like paper-oriented way to collect data in the primary sense, or even to access data, which is like on PDFs for that matter. I mean, a lot of us must have faced this like unique problem of data being coming in like a PDF format for that matter, to like what we would call as like more of a CAPI tool based, OK based or something like that. Now, how that changed the access way, the access parameter of it? Is it? I mean, objectively, it has just been easier to get the data from point of generation to a format which is easily understandable, manipulatable, and just analyzable. And we sometimes don't like fully understand the process that goes behind it, but any digital tool that we use to collect data, which may be, like if anyone is familiar with either Qualtrics or any ODK based form, the point at which a household for that matter is a general example, gives an just their idea like what the income has been for the last month, which itself is like a really noisy data. And if you combine it for I don't know, like 10,000 households, the data that comes to us and the inherent checks and qualities and the steps that's already can be integrated into the digital process itself. And there are ways to do this. Itself just makes the access so straightforward. Apart from the quality part of it, it's unimaginable, right? That something is being done in a remote part of India today, and you are sitting here instantly. And this becomes so important in case of monitoring, especially like concurrent monitoring or anything that requires very fast feedback loops. I don't think we appreciate this enough. Part of this is not only on the tool through which we collect, but also the advancement that we have had on data manipulation for that matter. So a large part of not data in hand, but in generally data ingestion for that matter now is slowly moving towards Amazon Web Services and other cloud-based enterprises, which just allows you to manipulate, store, and pre-process a lot of it before we get into the analytical phase itself. These two are primary examples. But I think that a large part of the access is something that we can easily see when we actually go and talk to smaller organizations who are not core M&E service providers for that matter, but everyone has been able to create or at least stitch together some sort of accessible system through which they get regular from the field, like to a large extent. Similar thing has also happened. We think of partly of the government data, right? So and specifically those data which are available in a format that is what we would call as open data, or like any standard is related to open data. So access towards that, the access of those data, how do we do this? How do we manipulate, and the data definitions? And the best examples of this is obviously the series of microdata that World Bank produces and everything. And all of these are benefited from the series of advances that we have made on the data and the tech format of it. So that's like part of access, and there are obviously other parts, but I mean, there's just not enough time to think about it. The second part is, which I think is probably the one of the really important part, which is data quality. And why I do want to focus on data quality is just because of the fact that we can make any number of efforts in getting data, analyzing, putting it into our monitoring framework, in our very nice evaluation techniques and fancy RCTs. Doesn't matter if we are just dealing with like really bad data. And the advancements that I think we are seeing, is very traditional, but that can be done at scale. So like all of the things that we know of, back checks and stuff is very easy to do with technology at scale. But slowly, a lot of, and even like organization I work with, a little bit, my work is also on trying to get into the advanced prediction-based models for data quality in itself, especially for any data that is coming in, and be it primary or otherwise. So I think that's another part that data quality is like slowly throwing in. And one of the reasons, and one of the papers that I think like I will ask everyone to read, is actually a JPAL experiment on the difference between the quality of data when you move from a paper-based assessment to a tablet-based assessment. It's phenomenal, right? The amount of like just manipulation that it has enabled, like not enabled, the system to do, and it's something just like blows, at least in my mind. The last part, which should be my concluding as of now, is on these intended and somewhat like sometimes unintended consequences that this entire tech-based approach brings in. So the first part is also dealing with the complexity, and like partly that enables like just collecting data for collecting data's sake, and just gathering data's sake. Just your average length of questionnaire is increasing, the number of indicators that we are doing is increasing without probably grounding the need in very solid theory that we're really needed for an evaluation purpose, really needed for a monitoring purpose and learning purpose, and so on and so forth. So that's like one of the bigger parts. This part on also on using a lot of these prediction-based methods indiscriminately is inherent bias that it brings in towards certain communities, towards certain genders, towards certain types of like pitfalls, and there is a very large amount of literature that points to this. And lastly, which is also like equally important, is the biases that we don't think about that can take place because the interaction that we are collecting is purely digital in nature. And this is very true for anything from a social network-based data, where we really don't know what happened at the point of generation, and this may just be some sort of a sentiment that's been put on a website because someone has written a comment for that. And when you put a lot of data like this, which you don't know how the generation has been, or you don't have enough information about that particular person or the type of community that that person represents, and run it through like some fancy algorithms, it again like brings back that bias or the lack of what you would call as like explanatory covariates to understand this phenomenon. So yeah, it's not a I mean, hopefully like it's not a pessimistic view of things, but I'm really interested and excited about the possibilities in the first two, and call for caution in the unintended consequences that this bring. Larger conversations, and there would be like many discussions on this even in this panel, the other panelists. But thanks for listening.
Thank you so much. So we heard from Krishanu a little bit about access and accessibility of data, around quality, some of the positive aspects related to quality, and then some things to watch out for example, bias and unconscious bias. So we're going to go over to Sahini now, and she's going to talk a little bit about ethics in data and technology. So I'll pass over to you, Sahini. She's online, so watch your screen.
Thanks so much, Linda, and thank you, Krishnan, for the speaker and setting us up. Sorry, I have a little bad cold. Please bear with me. Can everybody see my screen? Linda, can you see?
Yes, looks good. I can see it. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so hi everyone. As Linda mentioned, my name is Sambodhi and I work with Clear Japan South Asia. So I'll just quickly, in a minute, give you an introduction of what Clear is. So Clear is actually a global enemy initiative, which is coordinated by the independent evaluation group at the World Bank. And we have been in existence for over a decade now. And in South Asia and in India, our work is hosted by JPAL South Asia. So I will be, as Melinda mentioned, I will use my opening remarks to share some thoughts on ethics, and some of which is derived from the work that we have been doing in the enemy space for the last decade. So I think the first point that I really want to highlight here is the way that the internet is really allowing data to be produced, to be combined, shared, and analyzed. It's really redefining what personal data is and what type of protections that we need, right? So there is a blurring of line when it comes to personal versus public and what those are. Seemingly harmless data such as, IP address or the keywords that we are using in our search engines or even the websites that we are visiting can now be combined and analyzed to identify individuals and learn personal information about individuals, right? So in some cases, individuals are aware that they are generating information that is being collected. But in many cases, the individuals don't even recognize that they are leaving behind a trail of information. They do not know who is accessing that information and for what purpose it is being used. And how it is being used, right? And I think in the middle of all of this, I think the other important aspect is the role of government. So law enforcement can also track social media sites for information, some of which can be in ongoing investigation. So I feel that the issue of privacy, it actually goes beyond this research purpose, right? So what information that we are posting on social media, is this public information or is it private, and thus requires authorization for use, right? And there has been lawsuits that have been filed in US on the use of individual tweets, for example. But the Indian courts are yet to rule on some of these aspects. So I think that given the changing nature, it becomes absolutely important to bring out the exact definition on what is personal and what is publicly available information. And a clarity of that definition on public versus private will bring clarity to the concept of consent. So even public institutions will still need get consent if they are collecting personal data. I think the second point that I wanted to also talk a bit about is we should be mindful of the fact that the data that we collect, they come from human sources. Right? So there are contextual situations that shape individuals, and it becomes necessary to constantly keep an eye out of these contexts. Contexts are important to help us understand the population under which we are working in. This was also something that Rajiv mentioned in in his earlier opening remarks in the earlier panel. This gives us a clear picture of what could potentially be sensitive elements in the study and who would form the vulnerable population, right? And without understanding the context, one could easily put the vulnerable groups under unanticipated risks. So I think we should also keep in mind that the contexts evolve and they change, and we should also be mindful of that. I think the third point I really want to bring up in this panel is there is a need for uniform policies for data governance and management, including privacy, security, transparency. And in India currently, the country that I belong, the most comprehensive legal provisions that speak to the privacy of the internet comes from the Information Technology Act of 2000, which provides clearly protected user privacy. But I think future iterations of this act can really address some of the pending gaps that still exist. For example, the evidentiary status of social media content in India. Or the use of electronic personal identifiers across databases. If the individuals have the right to request service providers to take down or even delete their personal. So there is a lot of gray area that is still in existence in India, particularly on many of these aspects. And finally, my last point, I actually want to leave all of you with a question. So there is a digital divide in India where we see gaps in the usage and access of digital infrastructure, whether it is based on gender, caste, age. So we know that women have greater access to internet and greater ownership of mobile phones, right? And even to my left, the numbers that we see, so these numbers are from this year, from World Bank. We see that the internet penetration numbers are still very, very low. It is at 43%. So the inability to access technology has the potential to increase existing social exclusions and deprive individuals of essential resources. So given this scenario, I want us to kind of think, is the digital data world, is it representative enough to get the solutions to the population in need? Or is it actually recreating the overall demand? Thanks so much.
Thanks, Sohini. I think those are really, really critical points that you brought up in terms of how the internet is changing the nature of how we understand personal data and public data, issues of consent, and what are some ways that we can think about consent in the digital age. It's a really important point around context, both understanding context when we can't be there physically, and then making sure that we're aware of changing context so we don't put people at risk. Important points around the need for policies on data governance. And this really critical point around inclusion that you raised. And are we really, when we rely on digital data that's collected, big data or administrative data or data that's collected through digital tools, are we leaving out a large part of the population? So I think those are really key things that we should keep in mind for our work and for the discussion going forward today as well. I'm going to pass over to Shruti, who's going to talk about some of the types of bias that we can see in big data sets. So very specific types of bias that we should be aware of and work with big data. So over to you, Shruti.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for being here, and both to the audience and to my co-panelists and Linda here. I'll admit that when Rajeev first contacted me about this panel, I was both excited and really nervous. I was excited because I think, there's a real potential in using data, whether it's digitally collected data, whether it's alternate sources of data, whether it's big data models, to be able to collect data faster, more efficiently, and better quality, what Krishanu mentioned. But I think at the same time, we're marching towards collecting more data or collecting alternate sources of data without really thinking about the ethics and governance of it. So I think this is a very timely conversation to have. So I'm excited about it. At the same time, I was really nervous because the topic is so complex. Who owns all this data that we're collecting? Is it the person whose data we're collecting? Is it the person who's collecting the data or the organization? What does consent really mean? Shohini talked about consent, but I think for anybody who's collected informed consent on the field, whether digitally or in a physical survey form, we know how complicated that can be and what sort of power dynamics underlie collection of consent. Are we actually using and reusing the data that we're collecting? And what are the ethics of collecting data that we're never going to use, right? And to be honest, I don't have all the answers. I don't think anybody on this panel does. So I want to begin by saying that this space is imperfect, it's messy, it's evolving. And what is clear is that it requires a lot of critical and empathetic thought if we are to build equitable models around it. In the next few minutes, I really want to talk about 3 types of bias. I've tried to separate them, but they're all interconnected. Both Krishanu and Shohini have also touched upon parts of this in their opening remarks. And the 3 types of bias that I want to talk about is bias in data sets, bias in data models, and bias in the teams building the data models. Bias in data sets talks about representativeness of the data. The question that Shohini aptly sort of left us with, right? Who's being represented in digital data? The attraction, I would say, of using alternate sources of data is that it can be less invasive, it can be faster. We already have this data. So during COVID, we saw a lot of mobility data being used to guide health policy, to look at disease spread, to guide decisions on lockdown and social distancing. We regularly see mobility data being used to guide transport policy decisions. Where should new investments be made? And that's exciting. We don't have to go to someone's house and ask them how they travel to work every day and be intrusive. But at the same time, who's being represented in this data? There's an acknowledgement that populations that are represented in mobile data or call data records are generally more well-to-do, have access to internet. A lot of lower income groups, a lot of women and youth groups get left out of this data. So what is the validity of policy that is based on this data alone? Are we then building transport systems for those who are already somewhat well off? What happens to those who don't have the internet on their phone? Do we not build transport systems for them? So sort of looking at who is being represented within data sets. And also bias in how we interpret data sets. So a lot of satellite data is currently being used for poverty estimation. And one popular estimate is looking at roofs, right? Because you can see it using satellite data. And often straw roofs are seen as an indicator of poverty, whereas if you have a hard roof, then you're probably better off, or your household is better off. But that's not always true. Depends on your climate. Straw roofs could be actually more climate friendly for your area. It could also be that someone gave you a donation and therefore you were able to afford a harder roof. Doesn't actually indicate that your household is in a higher income level. So that's one level of bias, the bias in the data set who's being represented and how we're interpreting certain indicators there. The second type of bias I want to talk about is in data models, and especially in big data models that are being built. I'm going to use the really famous example of the Amazon AI hiring tool. So if you haven't heard about it, Amazon, I think in 2014, built a hiring tool using artificial intelligence to help them identify the top candidates for certain positions. Now, the AI tool learned really quickly that Amazon and really all tech companies were biased towards men, that they were more likely to hire you if you were a man, amongst other indicators. And what it did is it became more efficient at being biased. It identified this pattern. It started weeding out women from women's colleges. If the word woman was mentioned, even though they were blind by name and gender, there are other ways that the system learned to weed out women, right? Now, this is not to say that the bias was new. The bias clearly existed in human hiring, but the AI was more efficient in some ways. And that's saying something, because human beings are pretty good at masking but still propagating their bias. So that's the second type of bias that we want to look at, which is bias in the data models that we are building, especially because with the use of big data and AI and machine learning, there's a lot of opacity about what's actually happening in the model. I often have people coming to me and say, I'm using a machine learning model or I'm using AI. And I don't know what that means, right? I am not a data scientist. I am a lawyer who works in public policy and data governance now. So being clear about the data model that we're using and the biases that could creep into it is really important. And the third type of bias, which I think is often the least discussed type of bias, is bias in the teams. And there's an acknowledgement even on this panel that we all come from certain class, educational, locational, caste, privilege, and that guides the data models that we build, how we value certain types of data or skill sets. And unfortunately, what we are seeing is there is very little diversity in data teams across various different metrics. So currently, I'm in the process of wrapping up a landscape review on data sharing partnerships. And one thing that we see, in data sharing partnerships globally is when we ask about human resource and hiring, people are always hiring for data science skills, right? They're like, oh, we found these data scientists, they built this model, so on and so forth. And there's an acknowledgement, people are coming in, overwhelmingly certain populations are being overrepresented in these sort of skill sets. But also there's a value in what sort of skill sets we are hiring for. So in these same interviews, when we ask data sharing teams, what about sectoral expertise, contextual knowledge? The response is always, yes, that's important to have. We hire some consultants, we tie up with a local organization. But these are all fairly stopgap measures that don't value, let's say, the ability to build a machine learning model with the same way of understanding how poverty data sets may be biased in rural Mozambique. So we're not valuing different types of knowledge, all of which go into building our data models. And so I think that's really important to acknowledge, both within our own biases and also biases in the teams that we're building and the lack of diversity across different metrics that we are seeing, right? It is, in global teams, there's a certain kinds of bias, but even, in national and local teams, there are other kinds of biases that are creeping in. So yeah, that bias in data sets, bias in data models, and bias in the teams who are working on this data. Those are the three types of biases that I want to highlight. I'm really looking forward to the rest of the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Shruti. That was really clear for me. I hope everyone else was able to also kind of capture with those great examples of how we can bring in bias in different data sets, different data models, and teams that are building the models. And really, I really take to heart this point about the need for more interdisciplinary teams when we're developing data science out, and the need for expertise from various areas when we're working on, this tech-enabled MERL stuff. It's really important to not think it's only about the technology, because it's really about all of the things that we've all been working on in the past around participation, around diversity, around gender, around inclusion, and our good development, good evaluation ethics and principles that have always been a part of how we tend to do our work in this field. So thank you for that. I'm going to pass off to Akashi, who's going to talk about the evolving role of ethics, again, in the space, and thinking about digital data collection and ethics in that area. Thanks. Over to you, Akashi.
Thanks, Linda, and thanks everybody who went before me. The problem with going last is that pretty much everything you wanted to say has already been spoken about. So you're left with sort of, the role of somebody who's recapping and reflecting. And I was sitting here crossing out all the points that I wanted to make, and somebody had already made them. So in the nature of, adaptive evaluation, I'm going to go ahead and adapt to the situation and speak about what I had in mind. It's really tricky because before we start talking about the evolving role of ethics in this digital age in MERL or MEAL or MEL or whatever you want to call it, we haven't really even come to a sort of, we haven't really agreed to what are the ethics of development, right? What are the ethics of development? What are the ethics of monitoring, evaluation, and what are the ethics of research in the spaces that we occupy? And to add to this, another layer about the ethics of technology, right? And I think Shruti gave a wonderful example around the Amazon hiring program, and that was a couple of years ago. But as recently as last year, I think, in Google, we were speaking about AI. One of the top researchers at Google who uncovered how AI programming at Google was racist, inherently racist in nature, right? So we are now moving towards a space where we've sort of made everything more efficient, including translating our biases into action, including translating our biases into practice, into policy. So before we can even get into the space of talking about the evolving ethics in MERL, we have to maybe pause a little bit and speak about what are the ethics of MERL, period. Even prior to digitization. Evaluation is a value-laden field. We are passing judgment every day without questioning whose standards you're using and why you're using those standards, right? So what does this mean when we have a more efficient way of passing that judgment for vulnerable populations? Folks over here have already spoken about the inequitable nature of digital data, who has access to the internet and who doesn't have access to the internet. And I'm often, whenever I'm back from the field, which I sort of just came back this morning, it really sort of puts these things into actual practitioner, perspective for you. I was in the field and we were working with a couple of SHGs, self-help groups, women, are part of these self-help groups. And, somebody asked them, Didi, aap data kaise collect karte ho? For somebody who's been in this field for a while, I thought, to translate that, it's like, how do you collect data? To a woman from a rural background in India who's 8th grade. She completed 8th grade. And my first reaction was, what would she know about data and collecting? And she pulled out her smartphone. She had a Google form on it, which she showed me. I make an entry here every time I register somebody for something. And then that goes at the block level and somebody inputs it into the government database, and that is how data is collected. And I was like quite flabbergasted because even my enumerators in the field have issues running the CAPI sometimes, and I'm like, wow, this is quite fascinating. And then I started having a conversation with her, and I was like, why are you collecting this data? What is the purpose of it? And then she said that because I was asked to. Do you know what we are going to do with this data? No, I don't know. I was just told that if I put this information in here, I will get Awas Yojana benefits. And that sort of really put this entire conversation I was going to have today in perspective, right? I mean, we are collecting all of this data. In practice, there's technology that's, easing this collection process, that's easing the transfer of this data from a very grassroots level to a block level to a gram panchayat level to a district level to a state level to a national level, which then comes to my team and we use that secondary data and put some analysis on it and say this is what the condition is. But the people who are doing the actual work, the people whose data it is, do they know why there's data, what this data is going to be used for? And then it sort of, put me back in my old school mindset of what is informed consent? Why is informed consent? Is informed consent truly informed or not? Is it truly consent or not? And as an evaluator, you often grapple with the construct of IRBs, right? Like, we have to take IRB. We have to do IRB for this. And sometimes in evaluation, you're like, we don't need IRB because data ownership is the client. So why do I need to take IRB? And the client's not interested in taking IRB. And in either situation, the ground reality for that woman who's filling out that M form remains the same. She doesn't know what this data is being collected for. So irrespective of the strides that you make in the technology, the ease with which this transfer has been enabled, and how accessible it has become for a researcher sitting in Noida, which is where my office is, to access this data. The actual use of it. The purpose of evaluation was to make this better, right? Was to make policy better, to make programs better, to make projects better. Is that truly happening? And that is why this needs to be contextualized with today's topic of equity and transformation. We have these evolving role of ethics in digital data, all of that. But how does that fit into the broader theme of equity? Is there equity? And the real answer is no, and we're going to take a very long time to achieve it. And like Shruti had said very, succinctly, she had said that I don't have any answers, and neither do I. I just have experiences, and every day I'm hoping to do a little bit better, maybe something, move the needle a little bit better, start a conversation with people who might be interested, and get young evaluators thinking about this stuff before they think about, oh, I have to use Stata. Stata is brilliant. It's important. I use it. It is what makes me my money. Atlas TI, all of the tech you use to analyze your data, we've moved so much beyond physically analyzing data. But we have to start thinking about these intrinsic questions of equity, of ethics. Are we asking the people from whom we are, pretty much dealing their entire lives? Are we asking them whether they want this, whether they, how are we telling them how they're going to use this? We talk about how digitization has made dissemination easier. But are we using it to create forms that are understood by all stakeholders? Or are we only using it to create forms that are understood by a particular group of stakeholders who understand, visual PPT and heat maps, and all of that is brilliant. It's beautiful. But are you taking it in an audiovisual form to the lady at the SHG who's filling out that M form? So those kinds of things, I think, are issues that we have to continue to think about. And that's where I want to rest this opening remark. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Akashi. And I think those are themes and topics that I know I've thought about a lot, and I'm sure everyone who's in this room has thought about them, because the topic of today's panel is really around ethics and challenges. For me, I feel like sometimes it's really about this deeper and broader mindset, just even about how development work is framed, which is also often quite top down. And so if our development efforts are top down, if our support and service efforts are top down, if our evaluation is top down, if our data collection is extractive and kind of pulling things up the proverbial chain so that we can give this data up to government or give it up to donors, then I think we continue to feed into a lot of these inequitable and really not truly participatory processes. And I feel like that is problematic from a rights and ethics viewpoint, but it's also problematic just in terms of data quality. Because I imagine if someone is filling out a form and they don't know what's going to happen with the data is not useful for them, the data is not going to ever come back to them, they don't know what happens to the data, they don't really care that much about how high quality the data is. This is a sense that I haven't proven it with any data myself, but I just feel like, if data were more useful to the populations who are supporting and participating in providing it, it would probably be much higher quality, because they would want that data to truly reflect their situation. So I feel like more participatory, more inclusive, more equitable processes in development, in evaluation, and in data collection would all serve, a purpose, a big purpose to both improve our work as well as to improve the whole process. So there's some things that I've been thinking about as everyone's been speaking today. So I want to come back to some of you with some additional questions, kind of based on what you've spoken about already this morning, or this morning my time, sorry, this afternoon and this evening your side. And then also invite folks who are, there in person in the room, people who are online. If you have also any questions or comments about the theme, or you want to direct a question to someone on the panel, please do put it in the chat, or ask your question there in the room. I'm going to start off with a question back to you, Krishanu. What are some of the ways that we can address some of the risks and ethical concerns around digital data when we're talking about primary data collection?
Is it for Akashi or me? I think Akashi is better suited.
For you.
Okay, for me. Okay, yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I think like Sohini also has like thought about this like quite a bit, and so has like a lot of people here. And my short answer to this is that the fundamentals, I mean, be it digital data or any other data that we are either collecting or acquiring or just by happenstance are in possession of, I think that the fundamentals of all the ethical concerns around that data doesn't really change, which means we go back to the same defining reasons why we have created these ethical boards, the independent review boards and all. So which essentially gives back the same questions that we were discussing earlier around who owns the data, like whose consent is it, and I think like what Akashi was referring to as how do we really know that the consent that we have acquired is really a consent, right? I mean, given the power dynamics and all other things. So before I think anyone, and this is my my sense that before anyone goes ahead and tries to design something that feeds into some sort of a monitoring or evaluation or even like subsequent learning framework. So the basic primary questions around the ethics of just that data, and if it is a primary data, then obviously the consent of it, and then whether the context, I think Sohini was already mentioned, the context in which that particular data is collected. And then also a new concept that I have heard in recent years is around actually dignity. So that feeds back into this whole which very unfortunately sometimes it's a really a tick mark exercise for that matter. That like IRB, though like Lena has, we have to take IRB because the project needs to go. But there are really brilliant researchers who are right now thinking about dignity as a concept, which I think probably is something that is complementary to the other parts of the ethical framework that we, as a larger community, knows about in terms of how we have, gone through just doing terrible experiments in sociology to where we are. At least like that, that's better. So my sense is that combining these two, maintaining this sort of neutrality and some sort of a third-party accountability for the ethical framework, which is away from the researchers, away from the one that were generating the data in itself, and adding the dignity lens to it, which actually is a cross-cutting theme across different types of inequalities that can happen. Probably is a way to go, but it's very easy for me to like sit and preach this, and it's extremely difficult to ensure that in all the ways that someone can agree to give up their life, which comes to us as data, is actually ethically collected. And what happened like in the last 50, 100 years is so yeah, that's my short answer. But I'm happy for others to like add to it.
Sure. I wanted to jump over to Shruti, since you mentioned, Krishani, you mentioned the theme of accountability. And so I think, one way that a lot of organizations and scholars are thinking about accountability is within this framework of data governance. So Shruti, I know you had some thoughts around effective models of data governance. I wanted to hear your thoughts on that. And then Sohini, I'd like to come back to you, because I know you have some examples of supporting government with better data ethics. So we'll hear from Shruti and then come back to you, Sohini. I hope you're able to unmute again. Oh dear. Can we get some help to unmute Shruti again, please?
Okay, yeah, I think we got it this time. Thank you. Okay, so I think I'm going to take us down a slightly different track than what Krishana, Akashi, and Sohini, I suspect, are going to speak about, which is looking at alternate forms of data governance. I think we're all agreed that we want to create equitable models of data. We don't want it to be this extractive process where we think of this person as a data subject or data generator who's passive, right? We collect data from them, we talk about them in this abstract sense, and sort of say, oh, we're creating policy that will be beneficial to them. But it is rather extractive and rather presumptuous in many ways. So how can we shift the power dynamics around this? And I'm a lawyer by training, so I think, if we have better governance models and better rules, then we can do better. Naive as that thought may be. And over the past year or so, I've spent a lot of time thinking about what can be these alternate structures. And there's a lot of interesting models, still fairly nascent, that are coming out in different fields. Specifically, I would say agriculture and health, which are looking at both individual and group or collective empowerment around data. And this idea of data steward, somebody who is responsible, or it's not an individual, it can be an entity who is responsible for steering your data, right? So I'll give you an example of this. There's this really interesting organization called Join Data, based out of the Netherlands, whose core goal is to make farmers in charge of the agricultural data that's being generated. So for anybody who's worked in, or even peripherally worked in agri, it's shocking how much data we're collecting there, right? Just you buy a tractor and the tractor company knows everything that's happening on your farm. You sort of sign that off when you buy the tractor or buy some sort of new equipment and install it on your farm. So what Join Data does is allows farmers to pay a subscription fee, become part of their independent data platform. So you can see what kind of data is being generated about your farm, who's using it, who are the service providers who would like to access it, and whether you want to give that data to them. So the service provider then goes to Join Data and says, hey, I actually would love to understand how, I don't know, in northern Netherlands, how milk yield is changing based on this new technology they're using. Can I have this data? And as an individual farmer, you then have the right to say, yes, I can, or not. It's slightly more complicated than that, but that's the broad gist of it. We're seeing this in health. There's a data cooperative called My Data, which is trying to do similar, based in Switzerland, which is trying to do similar, perform a similar function for citizens who want to control their health data, but who also recognize that collectively health data can be used to promote innovation in healthcare. So how do you want this data to be used to give you that power, and also potentially the benefit tomorrow if there is something that flows out of it? Does that data subject or the data generator, what is their right within it? Now, there are lots of different models that can arise out of this, right? There are individual-based models, which is what Join Data and My Data to some extent are. They're like personal data stores. There can be data trusts, where someone has a fiduciary duty to hold this data. You sort of define what the collective purpose of this data is. And then the trustee, just like in a legal trust, has the responsibility to use that data in a fiduciary manner to promote the common objective. We're also seeing interesting ideas, or not interesting, really pertinent ideas around indigenous data sovereignty, because a lot of the models really think about data as in very Western ideas of individual consent, right? That's what informed consent really works around. My data, my consent, flawed as it may be, I'm giving that consent. But what happens to group data, or when a community has ownership over a certain knowledge or a certain practice? How do you value that? So we are seeing different models that place both the individual and the community at the center of the data collection, analysis, and use. Though I acknowledge that these are examples are still few and far in between. They're evolving. A lot of them are in the global north context. Not all of them. We've seen, fishermen's cooperative called Abelobi, which is based out of South Africa, which has come up with a really interesting data commons. I mean, they don't call themselves a data commons, but they're coming up with an interesting data ownership model. So we are seeing some of these examples emerging. They're still nascent. We don't know what they'll mean at scale, but I think it's really important to investigate this, because I think our current understanding of data collection is fairly extractive and broken. So we need to think about other models there. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruchi. And that's really fascinating for me, is thinking about these alternative, maybe they're not even alternative. Maybe that's how, way back in the day, that's probably how data was managed before it became kind of an industry, So I think kind of returning to some of those general principles and those community ideas around data, because for me, my personal data is really kind of just a mirror reflection of myself. And so if my data represents me, then I would want my data to be treated in the same way that I'm treated, with dignity, as we've mentioned already, And then in my collective, in my community, feeling the same way that my community's data is also an extension of my personal life and my collective life in my community. So those are really, really exciting, interesting concepts. And I hope we can chat more about those later on, as those are really key to some of the work that we're doing in MERL Tech as well. We've been finding quite interesting data models in African contexts that are kind of mirroring some of the ideas that you're sharing. So Hina, I wanted to come back to you a little bit about some of the work that you've been doing to support government with better data ethics. I know India is almost going to be tabling a newly drafted data privacy regulation that has been somewhat contentious, I believe, in some corners. So I'm curious, kind of how is this reflected in government data collection about communities or with communities? What are some of the things that you've been seeing a need to support with or to change at that level?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Linda. So I can talk about from Clear South Asia's perspective. We have been really working very closely with two state governments in India. One is the government of Tamil Nadu. So with government of Tamil Nadu, we have been working since 2014. So that's now over 8 years. So we have an institutional partnership that is with JPAL South Asia, but through Clear South Asia, we are really working with multiple departments and agencies of the government. So that includes Department of Evaluation and Applied Research, DEAR, as they're called. So with DEAR, we have been working since 2014, and our work has really been in raising awareness amongst the government on informed consent. So this should be an example. When we first started working, the general understanding of the government was, we are the government. Do we need consent if we collect data? It's our citizens, right? So even making them understand that even if you are the government, if you are collecting personal information, you still would need consent. So even going through that process, giving them training sessions on privacy and ethics was a big part of our work since 2014. We have worked with the Department of Economics and Statistics since 2016, which is also in the state. And there our work was what Krishanu was earlier talking about moving from paper-based data collection to digital data collection. But here as well, I think most of our work has also been on teaching their own government enumerators on ideas of consent, on data management, from ethical perspectives. Again, these are some of the themes that we really discussed in our trainings. And then with the Department of Planning, where we have been working since 2014 onwards. So amongst many things that we did, I think one big part of our work was, so the government, they wanted to come up with the state evaluation guidelines, and which we helped the government to do by providing technical advisory to that piece. But we also helped them think about the ethical, the chapter on ethics, so that the officers within the government who are working in this piece really understand how ethics plays out from a government piece. I think in addition to this, we have also worked with the Tamil Nadu e-governance piece. So the e-governance agency, just for context for others, it is a nodal agency which is formed to drive all e-governance initiatives of government. Right? And here our works, we have been working since 2015, where then we have them think about data management and setting up data governance policies. I'll very quickly talk about the Punjab example. So in Punjab, our work had been on helping the government come up with the first state data policy in 2020. So this was to help the government with guidelines and data management while ensuring privacy of the citizens. But I think one of the big piece of work that we are very excited and we are doing right now is the draft data privacy policy. And we're helping the government team through that. And some of the key inputs that our teams are actually giving are on protocols on maintaining privacy of citizens, setting up data security for backup, developing a privacy policy handbook, thinking through nuanced consent framework and how they might look like, and things like that. Over to you.
Thanks so much. Yeah, really interesting kind of practical guidance that's needed, I think, at government level, at district level, as well as probably individual evaluation shops or consulting firms should be thinking about their own privacy policies internally. Nonprofit organizations, development organizations, I feel like all of us need to be thinking a lot more about how are we managing data internally. How are we sharing data? As we talked about a little bit earlier, what are our data sharing practices and policies, and how do we frame data sharing in ways that that align with consent? One interesting thing, I think, in thinking about the whole data life cycle, from collection to storage and transmission to analysis to sharing to communicating with data to even retaining and deleting data at the end of an exercise. All of these things should be feeding into that consent as well, because if we don't know exactly what we're going to do with data, then we can't actually get informed consent from people about how we might use their data. So I think all these policies are really critical. I want to jump back to you, Akashi, because you mentioned a little bit about IRBs, and I'm curious, what is the role? You spoke a little bit about it, but what's the role of IRBs? And do you feel like IRBs are, current IRBs are fit for purpose in this kind of new digital age? The IRB committees that you've worked with, have they had an understanding of these aspects of, bias or the potential harms within digital data, and how do you find IRBs kind of navigating this new terrain of digital data and data analytics and big data and all of that?
Thanks for the question, Linda. And I'm going to expound on this, I promise, but the first thing that comes to my mind is no, I don't find them doing anything of that nature. But then IRBs are inherently, like somebody had mentioned earlier, they privilege a certain perspective of the world and a certain kind of knowledge, right? They privilege a certain way of knowing. And from as somebody who's academically trained, has a research background, I was consistently always frustrated with the IRB process because it never really, it put me at the center of the research, right? As the researcher, I was supposed to, was the center and the fulcrum of research, and everybody else who should have been, at the center of the research was not. And I see that translated in evaluation even more so because IRB is technically not required. I mean, in evaluation, because the program implementers have implementation permission, so maybe they are commissioned by the government or other agencies, etc., to run their programs. They don't necessarily always feel the need to take IRB or any kind of approval or ethical considerations of that nature. They just are more they're more concerned about knowing if their program is quote unquote working or not, and even that with respect to how they think it should be working rather than the beneficiaries, so-called beneficiaries. So in terms of technology, adding that to it, the maximum that we've seen, lately in IRB is that the little tick mark to say AV, audiovisual modes of data collection, or how will the data be stored and for how long and what format, and that not only is that not getting at questions around bias or when you're evaluating positionality, or are you explaining data use? If you see the front page of every informed consent that a participant is supposed to sign, very rarely do you see utilization of evaluation mentioned over there. Oftentimes you'll see that, oh, we will do this, we will do that, and you can contact this person in case you have a problem. Right? It's a very standard format, and very little do they actually take the time to explain why you're collecting this data. And I'm not saying that IRBs are completely useless and should not be in place, but I think there is a different model, and it is very nice to hear Shruti speak about different models of data governance overall. And I was wondering if, as individual independent evaluation companies, firms, or whatever it is that we are, or in evaluation units, certain governments and organizations, if there could be an internal setup even where you have external members that view these from different perspectives and look at a study and raise questions at the very least with regards to, are you considering all of these elements? And I think that should be something that evaluators and firms that do evaluation should think about as they go forward, about internal checks and balances. If it's not going to come from the legislative of a country, or if it's not going to come from a legal framework, then there is some ways that we can account for it as practitioners. So those kinds of models at more sort of localized level are perhaps something that we can think about.
I'd like to go out to others on the panel to see if you have any other thoughts around IRBs or ethical review boards, or have you seen any other interesting models for kind of these reviews? I know Shruti, you spoke about some alternative forms, but have you seen ethical review boards or IRBs that have kind of gone the extra mile and kind of gone to take on some of these topics and issues?
Unfortunately, I'm going to say no. I agree with Akashi completely. The checklist, or at least my experience of IRBs has been, if you know how to submit an IRB application, not the content of it, but the format of it, it'll be cleared. And I mean, we've seen questionable research being cleared by IRB, right? Which completely violates concepts of human dignity and justice. But what do you do? I would love to, but I haven't seen anything come out of IRB that's been different.
Any Sohini or Kushani?
Sure. So, unless Krishna, you want to go first. Okay.
Go ahead, Sohini.
Okay. So I think I would actually agree. Obviously, a lot of what Akashi is mentioning does resonate with all of us. I would also like to build on that and say that oftentimes as researchers, they are sometimes thinking about some of these ethical issues, but that doesn't get reflected in the working paper, right? So sometimes even journal articles, many journals just require an IRB approval number and nothing more, right? So if there are these trade-offs that the researcher is thinking through that is not getting captured in the paper, this leads readers to fill in the unstated information, sometimes with even potentially incorrect assumptions, which may not be what the researcher is even thinking about, right? So I remember Dean Carlin, he had this very interesting piece where he's talking about social science researchers who are engaged in primary data collection and who are considering these ethical issues in all their decision making. They should actually come up with something called a very structured ethics appendix. And he's saying that if you are coming, if any working paper that a researcher is writing, they should voluntarily come up with this structured ethics appendix that actually, not in a yes or no format, but in a detailed answer format, explains their ethical dilemmas on a series of questions that he actually has listed in this article. So I feel such initiatives, even if it is voluntary, would be very useful to kind of think beyond IRBs, right? So IRB is not the end all of ethics, and it should not be the end all of ethics for research. Yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Thank you. Thank you. And Krishana, I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, like my only sense is that like this, I mean, there's like a little bit of a historic baggage to this, right? Because a lot of these things have come from primarily academic, I don't know, like academic circles, maybe, and there the incentives are aligned to towards publishing and in some incentives that like not all members of the evaluation or monitoring community are aligned to, right? So I think though we are trying to get those incentives aligned again in one way or the other, even without an academic out being the only purpose of the project, but broadly, I think in the sector, I don't think the incentive aligned towards thinking about the ethical dilemma or the ethical concerns that one can raise just because there is not enough like demand, especially from people who can finance, and then be like there's not especially like enough supply from people who are pushing this out in a more in a non-academic way, because I don't think that academics will bring the change. So there has been some obviously conversations around the feminist lens, the dignity lens, and all of these are mostly pushed, right? They're pushed by funders, they are like demanded from the funders. But I guess that this also needs to have like certain incentives in this sector so that we can collectively respond. Or else, I mean, just coming down to individual morals, I'm sure if even the effective altruist or community like that can also be the only way to go forward. So it's a pessimistic note, but hopefully that's how we should go forward.
Yeah, I think it brings us back to, both the structural issues that we've been talking about, as well as individual responsibilities. And I think we do all have an individual responsibility to be an ethical person, an ethical agent in the world, in our work. But then we also need that support through better governance, through more accountability, and through greater structural pushes for improving our ethics as a field. I was going to go to questions. I don't see any questions in the online chat. I don't know if you have any questions in the room to address or any comments from those of you who are there in person.
So anyone in the room has any questions for the panelists or would like to add their sections or have comments? If anyone would like to share.
Sorry, we can't hear.
We have one question here, and then we can also, in the meanwhile, request everyone online to type in their questions in the chat box. In the meanwhile, we are taking questions in the room here.
Thanks a lot to all the esteemed panelists. My question is for Akashi. And Akashi, you mentioned that during the interaction with the field workers or that one girl, you realize that all our frontline health workers do their part of data collection so diligently, yet they do not know what to do, although it will help in their work effectively, right? And I work in the digital health and health sector domain, where lot of our decision making is dependent on the quality of inputs from field. Yet there is, in a way, a more practice that is followed, that only those part of trainings that are to be given to all the workers that are related to, say, their particular job. It may be collection of data using that particular form, not even how to use a smartphone, just to use that form. So I was thinking how we can, as a community, pursue or do advocacy towards any decision making. And this is not just for government setup. This is again related to non-government organizations also, organizations working in private data collections also. We have very myopic and in a way very resource constrained view of working capacity building of the frontline. So I was thinking how we can pitch and do advocacy for more holistic capacity building, in a way will result into a empowerment agency at a frontline health worker or or frontline workers in all domain, and also it will result into better decision making across the process.
So thanks for the question. And the answer that I have in mind has two parts. The first part is essentially, you know, understanding that evaluation is not an accountability measure only. Till we continue to look at evaluation monitoring just from the lens of, are we using our resources correctly? You said a resource constraint perspective, right? You're absolutely correct. Till we continue to think about evaluation, monitoring, etc., from the purpose of, is our resources being used efficiently, correctly, optimally? Till then, we will continue to have questions around resource constraints or resource excess, right? Once we start moving towards understanding that it is learning or putting back into a program that we need to do more of, that evaluation utilization is where evaluation is most useful and most effective, then perhaps we can start that mindset shift. And that's a very long process, right? That is, I don't know if I'm going to see it in my lifetime as a professional, but hopefully we can start towards that. The second piece of it is, I'm going to use two pieces. Linda had mentioned after it's spoken initially that, when somebody doesn't know why they're collecting data, are they even collecting good quality data? Right? That's a very important question. If you don't know why, right, would you do efficient and a good job of what you're doing? Would you even be invested in it? And then the second piece that Krishanu spoke about earlier was incentivization. So the incentivization for capacity building needs to happen for the funders or the government or whoever, and they need to be incentivized by using this carrot, more of better quality data, right? That if I don't tell this person why they're collecting data, how this is going to make the program better, then they're not going to collect good quality data, and that's going to scare any funder. So anybody who is, in evaluation is going to be terribly scared if I'm going to tell them your data quality is going to be horrible. So if you incentivize them to say, to invest in the capacities of these frontline workers or even enumerators in a more holistic evaluative thinking sense, right? Like not just the completing an action, but thinking evaluatively. If you incentivize that by saying that this is going to improve quality of your data, this is going to give us better results, we're going to be able to speak much better about your program, etc., then perhaps we can start seeing some shifts. Mindset shift is going to take forever, but this piece little maybe we can move towards. Thank you.
Krishan, I don't know if that, since the question I think was directed also for you. I don't know if you have anything you would like to add, Krishanu.
No, nothing that will substantially improve the answer. So I fully agree.
Great. Anybody else?
We have one more question.
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
Hello everyone. My question is regarding the qualitative interviews when we go generally. Hello, is it audible? My question is regarding qualitative interviews. When we go to the qualitative interviews, we record it in the audio format. We take the permission, consent from them that should we record this. Up to that, that is fine. But when next step happens from the perspective of evaluator is that these interviews get transcribed, and during the transcription, whatever they have, and especially in the case of regional language interviews, so there are chances that transcription losses can happen, or sometimes it can be misquoted. And in the report, in order to substantiate findings, the quotations are made in the report from the qualitative interviews, and most likely these reports would get published. So in a way that I think raises a lot of ethical questions, especially the person who said something and maybe misquoted in completely different sense in the report. So how can we address this kind of ethical dilemma?
You can open that to anyone on the panel. My understanding of the question is that indigenous language or regional language might be mistranslated, and then they might appear into a report in a different sense of what was originally meant. And so how could that be addressed?
I can take a stab, and this is a hard question actually. So think the part A of this is how the translation process is set up and how much you are investing, or anyone for that matter is investing in the translation process in itself, right? So there has, I mean, at least like I have seen in different contexts that there is a tendency to just also outsource the translation to the back to the enumerators themselves. And my sense is that unless and until you have a very strong command over both the languages, the one that the audio file is in, and the second is whether you're doing like this entire bit of almost like word by word translation, or also like some bit of adding some bit of thematic understanding to it. It just there is also a bunch of nuances and all. So part of this definitely either can be not fully mitigated, but at least addressed by like some sort of a dual translation in like a bunch of the same audio files translated twice by two different people, and we see this. And the second is obviously like taking help of professional translators. So there are obviously costly, but really good translators who are who can do this job. So that's like one. But still, there is a bunch of these loss of information, especially around expressive pauses and other things which are very rich quality of data that doesn't get through. So that's the first part, which is just on process. And then even the second part, which is so related to this, which I feel is very in like a very weird direction, is like using translation softwares, especially the newer language models that have come up that takes in audio files and give you a bunch of, even if like say Hindi file, yeah, it's a it's a different discussion altogether, and to be very wary about just doing that is probably like even at this point sometimes even worse than using an untrained translator. The second part on quotations. Um, uh, my personal view is that if someone is using quotation, we should have a separate consent which is done at a later stage when the quotation is selected to get it. I mean, there can be, I mean, in person, but even in like a phone call, that needs to be re-verified. We cannot like quote anyone without saying that this is like your quote I'm attributing it, especially if that person is identified on the report. And I've seen a lot of reports where people have identified it's just like this person and all. So that's like, again, going back to what ethical structure we have already set up for that particular project to ensure that it is not like some sort of misrepresented, and especially if those are very key takeaways from a report in itself. So that's what I can think about. And that's why also the quality data becomes in a, like, even harder to like put in the ethical format. I'm sure others have thoughts about this.
But I think I was thinking along the same lines as you, and unfortunately, many of the non-major languages in the world have very poor AI and very poor language support. So that's another piece of kind of democratizing technology, democratizing the way technology works and who it can support. I see that we are already 1 minute over our time today, if I'm correct in my time zone. So I think we need to close out the session. So first, I just want to give a huge thank you to Krishanu, to Sahini, to Shruti, and to Akashi for all of your exciting and interesting inputs today. Thanks for everyone who joined the session, both online and in person. We do have another session happening, a roundtable happening on Friday, which will be online, and we're going to discuss some of these topics additionally, and also talk about how we can advance on some of these topics, maybe as a broader collection of organizations, of individuals who are interested in some of these topics and issues. So hopefully you can find that on the agenda and join us on Friday. And thanks again to everyone for joining. Thanks for inviting me as well to chair the panel. And I really enjoyed my time with you today, and I hope you did as well. So I'll leave you all to go on to your other activities for the evening, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you, everyone. So as as most of you by now would have had a chance to look at the program schedule, we have more panel and day after, which are all virtual. So have a look at the program schedule and please try and join some of them. We have a lot of discussions and hopefully debates lined up for the next 2 days as well. Thank you.